On this week's episode, we take another look at the history of Portugal. I'm joined by Margaret J. Lloyd, romantic novel author and historian. We discuss, amongst other things, the very, very turbulent history of the 19th century, which included French invasions, civil war, family disputes, scandals, plagues, to name just a few. Welcome back, or welcome to another episode of Portugal, The Simple Life. And I'm really excited to be joined here by Margaret Lloyd. Margaret, or Marge, how are you? And thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Hello, I'm doing fine. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. I'm excited to dig into all of this information about the history of Portugal. But maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit about you.
Right. As you've said, I'm Margaret. I'm Portuguese. I've lived in Lisbon all my life. Actually, my family is not from Lisbon, neither side. I'm basically second and third generation Lisbon, but I'm so used to Lisbon by now. I'm a historian professionally. I spend most of my time, I specialize in ancient Rome actually, so it has not a lot to do with what I write. I'm a writer working on Regency romance. It's not really very matching. It makes sense. I'll explain why later. It makes sense, but it doesn't seem very matching, especially because I do military stuff for work, Roman army, and then I'm writing Regency romance on the side. And yeah, that's basically it.
You mentioned your family's not from Lisbon. Which areas is your family from in Portugal?
Yeah, so my mom's side is from Braga, Viana do Castelo, Braga, and they only came here with my great-grandmother and my grandmother. So my mom was the first person born in Lisbon out of that generation. And my dad is from Coimbra. And I'm first generation here on his side. He moved here when he was about 18 years old.
Okay, so you're the first Lisbonite from his family.
Yeah.
Those are two very historical places, Braga and Coimbra.
Yeah, and it's actually quite interesting to think that, especially on my mother's side, on my dad's side as well, my family may well have been there for the formation of the country, you know. My family might have been there because I've tracked my family history to a certain extent. I'm doing some family tree work, and I've tracked people down to the 1800s, and people didn't really move a lot. It's all in the same district. Yeah, we can do that. Portuguese people have free online access to parish records.
Okay.
So there's a few steps you have to take to reach the first ancestor you can find in records. But basically, if you do that, you can track everyone in your family tree because there's birth certificates, death certificates, marriage, and sometimes you can find some extras as well. So if you want to track your family tree, doesn't matter where you come from, you can actually do that online.
Oh, okay. Incredible. Tell us a little bit about your how you got into history as a profession. What was it that first fascinated you as a young girl and prompted you to get into this kind of work?
I don't remember a time in my life where I didn't like history better than most things. And I think it came from my dad because he was really into it as well. And I remember being a little girl and we used to go to monuments, historical places and all of that. And then I went to school and we had field trips. And nearby we have so many palaces and castles to visit. And we used to go there as kids. And it's really hard not to become, fascinated to an extent by the things that are around you. And I remember growing up in school, my favorite subjects were always history and Portuguese. Not because of the grammar, but because of the literature part, which is usually historical, because we do a lot of 19th century writers at school as well. So then when I had to choose, we have to choose a field in 10th grade, and then we have to choose university if you want to go in 12th grade. And I wanted to go. I chose languages and humanities, so my core subject was history and Portuguese. And then when I had to choose where to go, I just went for it. Actually, I changed. I was going to history of art, and I changed last minute because of an Erasmus program that I ended up not doing. Yeah, last minute, but I don't regret it. It was a very good change. I feel I hit the nail. I'm doing
Mm,
what I'm meant to be doing.
it's a good feeling.
Yeah.
It's difficult in Portugal, not, yeah, like you mentioned, not to get tied up in the history and get fat, because it's just everywhere that we look. You could be in a random. I remember once doing a hike through some random village in the middle of nowhere, and there were Roman roads, and you just like, wow, it's just everywhere that you look. There's this history that surrounds us. It's amazing.
Yeah, we had. I usually playfully say that everyone and their cousins was in this territory at some point in terms of Western Europe. We had contacts with the Greek and with the Roman and with the Suebi, and then we had the Visigoths. We had everyone coming here because it was an attractive place to be in terms of fertility, natural resources, and all of that. So populations just flocked here for many centuries. And we ended up having such a big mixture of different cultures, different civilizations. And that gives us such a rich history, a rich monument gathering, all scattered all across the country. And we have so many Roman stuff, and that's great for my field because I don't really need to leave the country to see the things I'm working on. You go, there's a really big place called Amaya. It's in Alentejo. It's still being worked on. You have Coimbra, of course, in Coimbra, which is quite large, but Amaya is still being explored, and it's a quite big Roman site. You have Roman bridges, Roman roads. You go to Lisbon, and you have old Roman ruins here and there scattered all across Lisbon. And yeah, it's really interesting that in Spain as well, it's really close. I don't know if you know the place. It's called Merida. It's close to Badajoz.
I know by the Hoshmas, but I don't know the other place.
Merida is a
Merida.
huge Roman city that survived near Badajoz. And it's so good because you can see so many things. And it's really nearby. It's 3 hours from here, 3, 4 hours by car. And it's so worth a visit. And it's beautiful. Then we have lots of medieval stuff. We have Visigothic stuff that survived somehow. And we have one in Braga actually. It's a really small chapel. It got lots of transformations, of course, because it's I don't know, it's 1,300 years old. I'd say, I think, but it survives somehow, and you can still see some remnants of the original site. And that was built in year 700. And then you move on, and you have all the early modern era stuff, which are more popular attractions like Jerónimos. That's more popular, I suppose. I see lots of people wanting to visit because it's in Lisbon. The panorama is amazing. You have the river right next door, and it's huge,
Yeah.
really huge. And then for me, the best part, my favorite part, maybe, aside from the Romans, of course, is the 19th century stuff, the beautiful palaces that we have, especially in Sintra. Sintra is the capital of the 19th century in Portugal in many ways. We also have lots of beautiful things in Porto. Porto also has a good gathering of 19th century buildings, but Sintra is iconic, I suppose.
We're going to get on into the 19th century. We previously did an episode about the fall of the Portuguese monarchy, and you and I are going to talk about what preceded that. But just quickly tell us about your books, the Regency
Yeah.
romances. Tell us about your books and what people should know about your books.
Right. So I really like Jane Austen, as you might imagine. And I was inspired by Jane Austen. I don't write in the same style, but it's the same concept, happy endings and comfort reads. That's what I'm trying to make. The world is so chaotic and often painful, even right now, that what I'm trying to make is comforting things that also have a historical background. Because I try to include like little names of people, of locations, furniture, hairstyles, stuff that people would encounter in their daily lives. So that's what I'm trying to do. And my first book, it was basically practice process. I'd never written a full-length novel, and I chose to set it in England and include a bit of the Bridport riots, West Bay Bridport riots in the 1815, 1816, following the fall of Napoleon in Waterloo and all of that. And then for this book, I'm actually including Portugal. The story is set in 19th century Portugal. Yeah, I'm not doing the most chaotic bits of the story because it's a romance and I want it to be comforting, not painful. But it has some snippets of what Portuguese gentry life, because I'm doing Jane Austen style, so I'm focusing on gentry, people with some financial abundance, of course. But yeah, it has some glimpses into what they might have seen, what they might have. So there's this English gentleman who went through a rough patch in the first book, and now he's coming to Portugal to heal and enjoy nice Portuguese weather.
And he meets a nice Portuguese lady.
Well, yes, but it doesn't go as planned. Quite as planned. There's a few twists and turns there.
Okay, so we'll leave it there because eventually people need to buy the book.
Of course.
Okay, what's it called?
You'll see what I mean. It's called, this one, the first one is The Art of Choice, and this next one is The Rose of Lisbon. It actually comes out tomorrow.
Okay, awesome. So we're talking about, today's the 30th of June. The book will be out by the time this is launched, which will be the 1st of July.
Exactly.
Correct? Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. You also do a little kind of editions, little snippets on your Instagram channel where you talk a little bit about British history and that sort of period. Why the fascination and how did that start?
I guess it started. See, my fascination with the 19th century is very specific. Because when I look at ancient Rome, I look at everything. I look at politics, economy, everything I can get my hands on. But with the 19th century, I'm mostly interested in the cultural part. So literature, art, and fashion to an extent. Because if you're looking at art, you're going to see a lot of portraits, and then you're going to see what people were wearing. And, mostly nobility and aristocracy, but also everyone else when the painting itself permits it. So I was at school. This all goes back to my school days. And I remember I saw two different paintings. One was of Queen Maria II of Portugal, and the other one was of Queen Victoria. They were actually friends. And I remember looking at them, and this is going to sound sort of shallow, but I remember thinking, well, that looks really good. I would wear that. And that made me curious. I was 15. And that made me curious. So I started looking into it more. And then I actually developed some interest in the people. Then I started finding painters and writers and everyone connected to the artistic world. Then I ran into the pre-Raphaelites and I fell in love with John William Waterhouse. And I just ended up going deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's how I ended up with the English 19th century. And then I found BBC Pride and Prejudice 1995 with Colin Firth and Jennifer.
Sure.
And, well, I got the DVD that says it all.
Okay. So, let's jump to 19th century Portugal. For people that don't know too much about this time frame, why was this such a fascinating and informative time in Portuguese history?
Well, the history of the whole of Western Europe at that time is really closely connected. And it all goes back to the mid-18th century, actually, because if you want to understand the 19th century, you have to look a little bit further back. So first in Lisbon, we have the 1755 earthquake. That completely changes the way people saw things because it was massive, destructive. It reached Spain, North Africa. People were speaking about it all across Europe, and the whole town needs to be rebuilt. We had many buildings that were completely destroyed. We had a complete gathering of, documents and all of that, and they tried to save some, but many weren't saved. We had paintings by famous Renaissance people that were destroyed in the earthquake. That changed people. That changed the mentality of the city. That changed even the king. The king was so frightened that he refused to sleep indoors. He kept sleeping in improvised spaces outdoors because he was terrified. The royal family only escaped because they were in Blaine, which is, a flatter area. Because otherwise they would have been taken by the earthquake, the tsunami that followed, the fires. It was All Saints' Day. Everyone was in church. There were hundreds of candles lit. So the city was destroyed. And then you think, well, now they're going to rebuild. Sure, we're going to rebuild. But then in 1789, you have the French Revolution. Another process of huge changes, and that sweeps over all of Europe. It's not just Portugal. Our neighbor Spain, Italy, France, even Prussia, Austria. No one is going to be immune to the French Revolution. And it doesn't matter on which side you are. The only thing that matters is that the ideas that are carried by the revolution are going to spread. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, that's just going to be spread across everyone in Europe. And we as historians, we don't like to work with the concept of sudden changes. Even that idea of the decisive battles, we don't like to speak of that much because it's not really that decisive usually, because for something to be decisive, you need to have a long track in the back. But with the French Revolution, I would say it's one of the few times in the course of history that I really can see a before and an after. There's a rupture. Of course, I'm not going to say that there wasn't a period of brewing before, but it's very abrupt. The change is very abrupt in mentalities, in economy, even in technology. So when we reach that time, Portugal is going through a bit of a rough patch. We were financially struggling because of previous government policies, and we enter the 19th century already being threatened by French invasions, and this is even before Napoleon. There was already a plan in course for France to come here because we were struggling in conflict. We were between England and France. Basically, we didn't have a lot of a choice, because when France starts trying to close up on England, we had we still do have one of the oldest still enforced alliances in the world, Portugal and England. So we had to choose. Do we make the English angry at us and close the harbors? Or do we make the French angry at us and get invaded? We didn't have a choice. We were going to struggle one way or another. So when we enter the 19th century, that's the state of affairs. Portugal manages to keep some neutrality for a while. We even sign a treaty with Catherine of Russia to see if we can keep that neutrality for a short while. But eventually, Napoleon goes up in power. And this was before Napoleon, but when Napoleon gets there, he thinks, I really want to invade that place. I really want this continental blockade that I'm trying to force to work. And so he sends his armies here. He never actually comes here in person, which is quite depressing, because even Julius Caesar came here in person. We didn't have that right. Napoleon didn't want to come here. But he sends his armies. He sends Junot in 1807. Then he sends Soult in 1809 and Masséna in 1808 and Masséna in 1809. They come here 3 times. The first one is by far the most successful, because Junot manages to stay here for quite an extended period. But the other 2, they just don't go very well, because on the meantime, the English armies come to Portugal to give us some help, because, well, we sided with England. We decided to side with England for several reasons, and the English armies do come here to help. Meanwhile, you'd think, well, that's chaotic enough. It's not, because it gets worse, because the royal family left.
Okay. Yeah. Just to come back to Napoleon, I mean, I didn't realize that his armies invaded 3 times. Why did? How long were they here? They were here, so say the first time was 1807.
Yeah.
And how long were they here for?
So they were here for a couple of months for the first time, but then the second and the third time they were really short invasions. Why? Because during the second invasion they made, I'd call it a bit of a strategic mistake. They tried to come in through Trás-os-Montes, and that's a very mountainous region,
Yeah.
And marching armies through mountainous regions, that's not the best. So it was sort of not very hard to keep them out. But then for the third invasion, they went through Alentejo. You'd think it would be a bit easier, but Portugal was prepared. Portugal, together with the English army, they knew that the goal was to reach Lisbon. So they had been preparing beforehand, and they fortified a series of locations called the Lines of Torres Vedras. You can still visit many of these fortifications. The goal was to not let the army go through the lines, reach the river Tejo, and reach Lisbon. And they sort of used the same strategy as the Russian army when Napoleon went and advanced towards Moscow. People started trying to cut off access to food. And what wins war is logistics. It's not battles. Logistics wins war. So people started trying to cut the access that the French army would have had to food. And they eventually had to retreat because they didn't have any way to feed the army. So that's how Portugal, together with the English army, managed to repulse the French soldiers.
Okay, interesting. And that was, you said that was the Linhas de Torres Vedras, so that's just a little bit north of Lisbon.
It's a series of fortifications close to Lisbon that were made to prevent the advancement of the French army.
Interesting. And that was the second one, and the third time?
Third time.
That was the third time.
The second time came through the north.
Because of the mountains.
Yes, and the third time came through Alentejo, and they tried to bar them from going through those lines, through the river and into Lisbon, because their goal was to take Lisbon.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so now we've just survived 3 attacks from the French. What happens next in the 19th century?
Yeah, so you'd think, well, maybe things will go better now. They didn't, because the royal family, they had escaped to Brazil, right? The goal was to preserve the Portuguese independence, because Napoleon had a habit of replacing monarchs with his own people, right? And the royal family wasn't very keen on that. So together with the English support, they decided we're going to leave and take the kingdom to Brazil. And they didn't want to come back. They were having a blast in Brazil. They didn't really want to come back. The crown prince liked it so much that he eventually decided to stay there for good. And it was a struggle because then we were left with Lord Beresford and an English-based government. And the people weren't really happy, especially because the climate was very tense. Anyone who opposed this government could be persecuted, and some persecutions did happen. And eventually, they were absolutely mad because he wanted to change some things in terms of recruitment and the military, and that would involve raising taxes. And people were already struggling. So when Beresford went to Brazil to ask for more power, he tried to come back, and he was locked out. He wasn't allowed back in.
Okay, so let's recap. So royal family don't want to get, let's say, assassinated by or replaced by Napoleon. They go to Brazil, enjoy the sunshine too much, and so we leave the country to be run by the British.
Lord Beresford,
who's British, a British guy.
Yes.
Okay. He wants more power to do more stuff and do more things, and so he goes. I'm really simplifying it. This is Portugal. And he goes to Brazil to get more permission from the royal family. On his way back, he can't get back in.
Yeah.
Okay, how did they stop him? I mean, what did they physically do to stop him from getting back into the country?
Harbor control, they were just keeping an eye on the harbors. You knew who was coming in, who was coming out. And meanwhile, you had an actual revolution, and that completely changed the course of the lines.
Okay.
Because you see, everything was going trickily, and then at some point you have an actual revolution. Not just because of Lord Beresford, but because there were other changes that people wanted to introduce. It's called the Liberal Revolution. It starts in Porto. And the goal was not only to, regain autonomy and not be ruled by Lord Beresford. The point was people wanted a liberal government, because until then, we had an absolute monarchy. The king had all powers and all of that. It was still like in old times France before the revolution. And even though we sent the French away, the ideas came in and people were starting to want something different. So a group of people decides we want the division of powers. We want a constitutional monarchy. We want an actual constitution. We want to change things. And above all, we want a king to come back, which he eventually did. So that's how in 1822 we get our very first constitution ever. And the king does come back and he swears it.
When was that?
22.
1822. Okay, so what does a constitutional monarchy look like in comparison to just a normal monarchy?
Well, most monarchies that you still have today, they are constitutional monarchies in a way, because there's a division of powers. Before, you had all three powers concentrated in the figure of the king. He had absolute power. He could take measures. He could do everything. But with the constitutional monarchy, the king has the executive power and the representative power. But then you have a parliament that does the laws, legislation. You have elections. You know, you transition a little bit into the 19th century is basically the period where the monarchies that we still have today change into their current character, slowly but steadily. So that's the goal and the purpose. And Portugal actually had a similar system until 1910, which is when we stopped having a monarchy in general.
So 1922, we're now not even halfway through we're not even a quarter way through the century. It's been rough. It's been rough already. The king comes back. What else? What are some of the other challenges that made this century so fascinating?
Right, the king comes back, right? And then the crown prince stays in Brazil.
Okay. He didn't want to come back.
He didn't want to come back. At some point, he proclaimed Brazil as an independent state. That also changed the course of...
Okay, so that's at that time, Brazil was a Portuguese colony.
Sort of. Brazil was a Portuguese colony, but then when the royal family went to Brazil, it acquired the condition of kingdom. So we were a united kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, etc., etc.
Okay.
So it had a different legal status, so to say.
Okay, it was part of the country or part of the kingdom, but not a colony, not under our rule. It was
at that point. It was an independent kingdom, part of the United Kingdom. Yes. But the prince, the crown prince of Portugal, he decides that he wants Brazil to be independent fully, no connection to us. So he declares that, and he becomes the first emperor of Brazil, as Pedro the First.
When it was part of the kingdom, was it called Brazil?
For part of its history, yes. At that point, yes. In the beginning, it had other names, but for a majority of the story, yes.
Okay. And then it became independent as a Brazil, a self-governing country under the ex-crown prince of Portugal is now the king of Brazil?
The emperor of Brazil.
The emperor of the new independent Brazil.
He created a new place, so he might as well go for the big title, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been something a little bit more modest, but he went big. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. What happens back in Portugal? What's the next big event in the 19th century?
Right. So the king comes back, and allegedly he swears the constitution, but then you have a series of coups. You have the Vila Francada and you have the Abrilada. And what's that? That's basically the youngest son, Infante Miguel, and his mother. Okay. They don't like the king. They want to go back to absolute rule. And they start trying some coups against the king. And they lose the coups, but the king does regain powers anyway. So he exiles his son, but he gets some powers back anyway.
Okay. So they want to the son and the mother and the wife of the king want to return to an absolute monarchy.
Yes.
Not a constitutional.
Not a constitutional. And
they try to overthrow the king.
Exactly. So that the Infante Miguel would be king of Portugal.
The new king of the absolute monarchy.
Exactly. And I like to say, people confuse this a lot. Infante or infanta in Portugal is the same as prince and princess in England. Okay. The only difference is we do have the title of prince, but that's just for the crown prince. It's like in Spain. You have a crown princess right now, and she is Princess of Asturias. Because there's no such thing as Princess of Spain. You have Infantes of Spain and the Prince or Princess of Asturias, which is a specific region. And the same happened in Portugal. So he's basically the equivalent to a prince.
Okay, so that family's had a bit of a real fallout because one of them didn't want to come back. One of his sons doesn't want to come back, takes over Brazil. Yeah. The second one, in alliance with the mom, he's a real mommy's boy, tries to overthrow his own father.
Yeah.
Fails,
and gets exiled to Austria.
To Austria?
To Austria.
And the wife
That's
as well?
No, the wife was actually locked up in Queluz Palace.
Okay, for how long?
She's very well known. Oh, until the end of her life. She's Carlota Joaquina. She's very well known. She was a Spanish infanta who married our king, to try and appease stuff in the late 18th century.
She was actually Spanish.
She's actually Spanish, and they don't get along at all. And there's some rumors. Well, you know how history goes. There's lots of gossip. There's lots of rumors about whether Infant Miguel is the king's son or not. The king's son or not. There's lots of rumors about that. But, that's all gossip. But it's worth looking into because it shows the popular perception of the queen, And, at some point, some people, they were not seen with, kind eyes by the liberals, the supporters of Miguel and Carlota Joaquina. And at some point, they were called the hunchbacks as a derogatory term.
The supporters were called hunchbacks. What's the Portuguese word for that?
Curcunda.
What?
Curcunda.
Curcunda?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a derogatory term that was used for conservative people in the traditional absolute rule line, sort of.
Wow.
Right. But then what happens, the king dies not long after this. And it's not
probably from stress.
He was murdered. And how do we know this?
Okay.
We only found this out very recently because every person in the House of Bragança, it was the last dynasty we had, every person but two is buried in the same place. It's in the monastery of São Vicente Fora. It's in Lisbon, close to the Pantheon, National Pantheon.
Yeah.
The street right on top has another monastery, and that's where all the Braganças are except Pedro, that crown prince. He died in Portugal, but he was sent to Brazil, which makes sense.
That's in Graça, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the Pantheon. And then we had a king later on, Ferdinand II. Prince Albert's first cousin, actually. He had a Pantheon made for the Braganças, just for them.
Okay, so the new king, so the guy's just got betrayed by his whole family and then he gets murdered.
But we didn't know that.
We didn't know that we only knew this recently.
And why? Because he was sent there and when he was being embalmed, some of his organs were removed and put into urns.
Okay.
And those urns were placed in a different place within that monastery. So when they were doing some archaeological work there, they dug up the vase, the jar, the box with the entrails, and they actually analyzed the
organs,
the remains, and they saw they had poison. They had poison in them, and it's not commonly spoken of, but it's concluded that the king was poisoned. And at the time, people did wonder, was he poisoned? Was it a natural death? But they didn't have any way to know. But now we know that he was murdered.
Wow,
rough. We don't know by whom.
Rough time for that king. Betrayed by his family,
rough
poisoned.
Time to be a king in general, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, so who succeeds him after he dies? I mean, we don't know that he's died of murder by then, but who succeeds him and why?
We have a regency, and the Regency Council decides that the crown can only go to the crown prince who abdicated his rights, and stayed in Brazil. So what happens? That crown prince is king of Portugal for only 2 years. 2 short years.
He came back?
He didn't come back. He stayed in Brazil.
So he's the king of Portugal, but from Brazil?
Yes. But there's there's an agreement that is reached for peace. He married Leopoldine of Austria. She is the daughter of the last Holy Roman Emperor, so pretty high ranked. They had 4 surviving girls and 1 boy. And the agreement that he made with his brother, actually, was that his eldest daughter would marry her uncle when she was of age. And she would come to Portugal and they would co-rule under the constitution that he made, because he made a new one called the Carta Constitucional. And they would rule together under the new constitution that he created. So he was only king for 2 years, and those 2 years were used to abdicate on his daughter, make that sort of agreement, give us a new constitution, and give us a national anthem, actually, as well. We had a different anthem back then, and he was the one who wrote it.
Wow.
The marriage didn't happen. She didn't marry her uncle in the end.
That's, okay. Wow. Okay, that's a lot. I mean, you could make a movie about this.
It's a lot to unpack, isn't it? It's very chaotic.
Incredible. And that all happened before?
That all happened before 1830, basically.
So, okay, so we haven't reached even halfway through the century. This has all already happened.
We haven't reached halfway through the century.
Wow. Okay, what happens next?
Right. So the little girl, the future queen, is 7 years old. So she's in Brazil with her family.
This is the one that's supposed to marry the uncle.
Exactly. See, I know it sounds weird to us, but back then for royalty, uncle and niece or aunt and nephew was not really super rare. It was unusual, but it wasn't impossible. For example, the grandmother of this crown prince, she married her own uncle, and her sister married her nephew. So it was a royal thing, royal connections, very, very connected. Anyway, but this little girl, she stayed in Brazil. Miguel comes back from Austria, and he allegedly agreed to the terms that his brother had written down, but then he's not going to do that. He just comes back, he breaks off the engagement, and he says, well, I'm an absolute king now. Sorry, I'm gonna do what I wanted anyway.
So this was the one that was exiled to Austria with his mom, she wasn't exiled, she was put in prison. Miguel comes back.
Home prison, sort of, yes.
Yeah, okay, but locked away.
Yes.
He comes back from Austria and he gets what he wanted in the end.
Sort of, for a short period of time. Because, see, the crown prince, then emperor of Brazil, he decides to abdicate the crown of Brazil on his only son, Pedro II of Brazil, and he was the last emperor of Brazil. And he came back to Europe with his daughter to fight a war against his brother to retrieve the Portuguese crown for his daughter. Right.
Wow.
So we have a civil war.
Okay, I'm going to just play a little thing here. So is it possible that Miguel arranged for the king, his dad, to get poisoned so that he could come back anyway? Conspiracy theory.
We don't know. It's impossible to know just now what happened. I mean, I wouldn't put it past him. I would point to the mother more, actually. I would point to the queen more than to the son.
Doing that. But she was locked away, supposedly.
Yeah, but she was here, and she had supporters, and she really didn't like her husband a lot. They didn't get along well at all. So I would see the queen doing that for her favorite baby, sort of, more than... But, it could have been anyone, could have been a politician, because, people were divided. The liberals and the absolute rule fans, they were divided anyway, so it could have been a politician.
Okay.
It could have been Miguel, could have been Carlota, could have been anyone.
Okay. So then Pedro and Miguel have a civil war.
Indeed.
How long does that last?
War. About 2-3 years. It's not very, very long, but it's very destructive. Maria comes to Europe. The little girl comes to Europe. She spends some time in England, some time in Paris. She goes back to Brazil, then she comes back here. It's very chaotic. But eventually the liberals do win the war, and she does get to be Queen of Portugal. She's 15.
So whose side was the liberals? That was
The liberals were with the Crown Prince, Emperor of Brazil.
Pedro.
Yes, he was in favor of a constitutional monarchy and, new systems. And they win the war, and Maria becomes the second queen regnant that we ever had. We only had two. Maria and her great-grandmother, also called Maria. And she becomes queen, so you'd think maybe things are going to settle a little bit. Now we have the liberals in power, we have a new queen, a symbol of hope, but it doesn't go quite like that. Her father died only a few months after that happened, so we're left with an underage teenage queen. She was very young, and she was the only...
How old was she then? How old she would have been then, Margaret?
15. She was 15. Yes, jeez. When she... Okay. Yeah. And, I mean, imagine being born in Brazil, spending all your life in Brazil. She was the only Portuguese queen, I think the only Western European queen born outside of Europe at that point. She had never been here, and she suddenly finds herself here at 15. Her mother died when she was a little girl in childbirth. Then she lost her father. All her siblings were away except for a half-sister who was a tiny baby, sort of. So she was left all alone at 15. It's heavy.
Yeah.
And then she gets married because we need heirs, We need an heir to finish this uncertainty, because otherwise we will just keep getting the threat of Miguel.
Yeah, because he's not married. So he wasn't killed or anything in that civil war.
No. They made an agreement, and there's actually a big problem there, because some people call it the Convention of Evremont, and some people call it the concession. Why? Because he was sort of forced to sign it. It was either that or nothing. But when he went to Austria, because he went back.
He goes back to Austria.
He went back. He basically gave up everything. I think he was entitled to receive a sort of an allowance, and he gave it all up because according to that convention or concession, he had to give up the rights he had to the Portuguese crown. And he decided to give it up and say, I was forced to sign it, I still have these rights, etc., and be a claimant, basically. And ironically or not, we currently have the current claimant to the Portuguese throne, the most consensual one, and the one that is, acknowledged by the Portuguese state, descends not from Pedro and his daughter, because that line is extinct, but from Miguel.
Okay. Crazy.
We are trickier than we seem. We had a very intricate history during that time period.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens after Maria?
Yeah, so she has to get married right away. She first marries her stepmother's brother. And the poor fellow, he was from the paintings I've seen, he seems like a handsome-looking fellow. So you'd think she would have been, happy.
Happy to marry a handsome guy.
He just died not long after the marriage. The wedding happened. The poor fellow
How did he die?
We believe it was a tonsillitis infection that got out of hand. But, we had lots of epidemics during that time period. And I remember reading something about it as in he had a sore throat, but he was playing billiards and doing life as normal. But then just a few hours later, he started decaying, and he died.
Okay.
And
so her new husband dies.
You have a teenager, widowed, orphaned queen. No heirs.
There's a book title for you there, Margaret.
The orphaned, widowed teenager queen.
Yeah.
That's quite a story to tell. But then she gets married again, and that's when you really start seeing the influence of royal intermarriage in diplomacy in the 19th century. Because who does she marry? She marries Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and he's Prince Albert's first cousin.
Okay.
So they have a close connection with the English royal family. They write letters to each other. We still have some of them around. Maria and Victoria exchanged letters and all of that. And well, the royal family does have some support from the English government during this period, because from that moment onwards, you had several factions. You had the liberals, you have the absolutists, and then within the liberals, you have the people who want the 1822 constitution and the people who want the 1826 constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So there's wars to see and civil uprisings to see which constitution is going to be used. And it's a problem because the people in closest to the palace, Maria, etc., want the constitutional Carta because her father made it. But the other people want the 1822 constitution. So you start having lots of uprisings. They just don't stop.
So the country's just always in upheaval. There's never any continuity. This is bad for the people as well.
Yeah. Our financial condition when we reach the mid of the century is quite difficult. And between the wars and the revolution, we were supposed to be advancing with the rest of Western Europe and having the new technologies installed here. But it took longer because you can't really install technology if there's constant war and constant revolution. We had revolutions over things like the prohibition of church burials, for example. Because at some point, back then people were buried inside the churches and then they realized it wasn't very sanitary. So they decided to ban that. And we had revolutions over that because the people just didn't want cemeteries. For example, we had revolutions.
It's crazy because cemeteries are such a fixture today of Portuguese architecture. Every village, it's right there, front and center, and we almost didn't have them.
Well, it wasn't just the cemeteries. It was a bunch of things. People were also upset over taxing, over reorganization of politics, of military stuff even. But, that was a taboo thing going on as well. And the thing is, we had such a high death rate that you couldn't really bury everyone inside the church, even if you wanted to. Because, see, when you reach the 1830s, 40s, 50s, you start having really bad epidemics. You start having cholera, you start having yellow fever. They come through ships and they get into Lisboa and Porto. And they start taking so many lives. If you go to Cemitério dos Prazeres in Lisbon, that was sort of made to accommodate the high number of people that were actually dying in consequence of those epidemics. And you see so many young people who died in that time frame. You see young girls just married, 21, 22 years old, who died and have really sad epitaphs of broken-hearted parents, broken-hearted husbands. You have little children. So yeah, we needed that extra accommodation because of all these epidemics, but people were not very receptive to the idea in the beginning. And then aside from that, between the inner turmoil of the parties, because the parties just weren't really connecting, and you had different people wanting different things as usual, Portugal just wasn't able to recover from the upheaval of the early century anytime soon.
Wow. Okay. That's an amazing period of our history. It kind of puts the whole way that Portuguese can somehow survive through suffering and difficult times into perspective. We've been doing this for much longer than what we actually realize. Let's put some positivity out here on this episode. You mentioned you love there's lots of sort of pieces of architecture and buildings from the 19th century that you love. Yeah. I'm going to ask you to name 5 that people can check out and visit. I know it's difficult, but try 5 of your favorites. And
just
why?
19th century?
Yeah, just 19th century.
I mean, you have the National Palace of Pena. That's one. In Sintra, it's a big tourist site. I know people really like Quinta da Regaleira That's very late 19th century.
Okay.
And
That's the inverted spiral staircase that goes into the ground, right?
Yes. That's the one with the initiatic well, or however they're calling it now. You have Montserrat as well. You have...
What's that place? Tell us about Montserrat.
It's also in Sintra. It was one of those big noble houses.
Okay.
You actually have a new one that just opened. I don't know the name, but I know there's a new 19th century palace that just opened in Sintra. And there are many others that are in process of being restored, but still aren't open to the public. Let me see. I know there's one. I visited one in Braga. I cannot remember the name, but it was, gentry home. I cannot remember the name for the life of me right now, but I know we visited it, and you can still see the coaches and all of that inside. And 19th century, because usually I mix the medieval stuff in Sintra with the remainder of them. So
medieval, we can do a whole nother episode on that, on medieval history.
Absolutely, we have so many things.
Yeah,
I don't know. Okay. Anything in Sintra, basically.
Okay, anything in Sintra. Margaret, let's come to the present. Just a quick thing for people listening. What do you love about your country today?
Today, the food. First and foremost, the food, the pastry, the fact we are, well, of course not everyone is the same, but I think that most of us are quite open. We are open people. We are receptive to new ideas and to new people. I love how we call it desenrascar. We make things work one way or another. I like that trait about us. We survive one way or another. I like that.
Yeah. Okay. Margaret, this has been so fascinating. A movie about Portuguese 19th century would be like a Lord of the Rings, three or four movies, but it's phenomenal. So thank you so much. This has been so interesting. But what's one thing that you would like people to remember and take away from our conversation?
I would like Portugal. I know we have so many countries in the world and they're all wonderful, but of course I'm partial to mine. And I would like Portugal to be on the map more, so to say. I would like people to realize when they look at us, or when they're just finding us out, how rich we are in terms of culture, history, even the whole personality of the country, so to say. I would like people to look into that and see that we are so much more than, the big ex libris that we usually have. Fado, for example, is cultural, yes, but we have so much more. We have more music than fado. I would like to see more of our diversity coming out into the world.
Perfect. How can people listening and watching follow you online, stay in touch with your work, stay in touch with your book launches, things like that?
To chat about the 19th century or anything like that, I'm on Instagram and I'm on Twitter, and it's always the same handle. It's author MJ Lloyd, 2 L's. So if you want to chat about that, I'll be there.
Awesome. Perfect. Margaret, after such a complicated story in the 19th century, a question that we ask all of our guests: Portugal, the simple life, why?
Many people will tell you many different things, and they will focus on stuff that I've mentioned. For example, they will tell you the weather is great, the food is great, but to me, what really makes me feel good about Portugal is that I feel safe. I know this is not everyone's reality. The country has, unfortunately, it has its ups and downs, it has different areas, but for the most part, I think Portugal is still a place where you're able to go outside, you're able to visit monuments or to meet people and feel safe. And I think that's really important, especially nowadays.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Shall I call it?
You can call it.
All right, that's a wrap.
So thank you once again to Margaret, and thank you to all of you for listening. Please subscribe, share with your friends, give us a thumbs up, and please leave a comment or a review. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. And as we say in Portugal, abraço. Welcome to the simple life.